I'm just down at the Foxton Beach estuary where they're about to hold the annual welcoming of the Godwits back to New Zealand. The Godwits are returning from their migration from last year up to Alaska and then back down again here to New Zealand. Everyone's starting to gather. Lots of bird watching organisations here at the moment. Foxton Estuary hosts quite a number of different species actually, exotic species.
The birds back here, and Tahu's people have been, well, when I used to live down here as a little boy, they lived just around the first corner, and so they've been here for a long time. There was always, well, not a marae, but a settlement here on the verge of the river itself. And but I was just saying to some of the persons a while ago, the bay would have been full with rowboats, and there were only 2 boats with an outboard motor, and each of them was a little seagull motor, and they were the only motorised boat craft in the bay, save for one launch. And so it was a completely different setting in the weekends. If you wanted to go up the river, you waited for the tide, and when you came back from the river, you waited for the tide again. But it was a very placid setting, very much like it is today on a good day.
And the school, I went to Foxton Beach School, and we came down here for our swimming lessons.
Oh, that's very wonderful.
Yeah, no, it was wonderful. And there we go.
Yes, so did I.
Yes.
All right, Tohu, thanks.
Apa Māori e koutou, tēnā koutou, nau mai hara mai ki tēnei wāhi o te whārani. I mua ai a koutou, te awa o Manawatu, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, nau mai hara mai, hoki mai anō ki tēnei wāhi. Mihi atu anō ki o tātou nei mate, nā rātou ko hinga. Haere atu rā ki tua te ārai. Ko tō pīrangi ki te noho ki o runga i te ringo o te āreki ko ihu karaiti, ka pai tēnā. Huri no ki tā hongo ora tātou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko toa mai nei ki te karake te hokinga mai o te kuaka, no reira e tuki tēnei karake. Tākiri ko te atatangi ko ngā manu, e moi ko te pōe. Nau mai ko te awatea, nau mai ko te rā, kia mahana ai te kiri. Wāre te ara, wāre te papa, wāre te oni tapu. Tūkua te rā haki a kino, whakaara te ake a pai. E kui mā, e koro mā, tāwharau te tira nei, ko tai mai ki te mirimiri, ki te tūhono, te tai mai o te kuaka. Koutou nei ngā tangata, ka hara mai ki te titiro tēnei mea, nō reira tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. Me o koutou kaha ki te tai mai, ki te titiro ki ngā manu. Nō reira tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa. Kia raro.
Yeah, thanks very much, Connor. Yeah, and the other person, of course, we've got to introduce is Phil, Dr. Phil Batley. And with Phil, it's a passion. No, it's a profession as well as a passion. And when you've heard Phil's address, you'll realise how personally he's associated with some of the birds. They might have numbers and things like that on them, but they've become part of his conversation. And so perhaps had he been given other opportunities in life, he may have been a poultry farmer or a bird keeper. But no, we're very thanks for Phil to be able to come down. He comes down on an annual basis, and we can hear what the studies have been, and they are virtually the branch of the international studies on migratory birds. And so that's more than just an interest, it's a privilege to be here and hear Phil. Thanks very much, Phil.
All right, welcome everyone. So we've been caught out a bit by the lovely weather because normally we would be expecting the tide to be higher and the birds that are down on the point down there with the gulls to be up here. So we've got such a lovely day, beautiful high pressure and no westerly wind means all the water's just pushed down and slowly flowing out to sea and not being held back in. So it's going to be a matter of luck. Possibly, we'll just keep our eyes on the birds on the spit where those gulls are to see if they will come around here, and if it turns out they don't, then we have the option of hopping in cars, driving around, getting sandy feet and going and having a look at them there for those of us who are able to do so. So as Calvin said, we've been working on birds, monitoring them here for 14 years, quite intensively now, and we've done a whole lot of banding and tagging and also satellite tagging, and we're also looking to we're doing more of that this year, so we expect to see more from that. So the season, some of you may or may not have seen snippets on the news and things, or Adrian Regan's Facebook post from the Korakora Miranda Naturalist Trust about the fates of Godwits this year. We had 3 adult Godwits that we would track for the 3rd year in a row. So the thing with these transmitters that we use, they fall off eventually. They're just held on a little harness around the legs. So we lose them eventually, but of 20 we put out in 2019, 3 of them are still going, and these 3 all completed their migrations. They didn't do anything particularly exciting or interesting in a way, but they did quite well. But we have a bunch of young birds that were also tagged as juveniles, babies in 2019, that have still got tags on them, and many of these are now making their 1st or 2nd migrations, and these have been quite interesting. There was one of these in March, it was a bird that was tagged here in the Manawatu in November 2019. December it took off and was the first bird to leave, and it went probably around the bottom of the North Island, around East Cape, and ended up in Coromandel, and it's made Coromandel its home ever since. Matarangi is where it stays. Earlier this year, it went off on migration, all looking good, and then it decided to stop for no apparent reason at Papua New Guinea and spent 5 months hanging out in Papua New Guinea. And then in August it came off into the beautiful line back across to the Manukau Harbour, and then a few days later back up to Matarangi. So it's made Matarangi its home, and this is what we're interested in understanding. There's a process by which birds that come to New Zealand look around, explore, and decide what's going to be their home and what isn't going to be their home. So we've had a lot of birds from the Manawatu that we've tagged that have spread off around the country. They've ended up in different places. We have some that we've tagged here that are still here and residing here. We're finding that they are quite, not infrequently, popping over to Farewell Spit for a little visit. So we had some that just one weekend take the flight off to Farewell Spit, overnights there and then comes back. Maybe it just cleans its leg bands with a bit of sandblasting or something. So it's 190 kilometres to Farewell Spit, so it's sort of a 400k round trip they do, but it's nothing to them really. We're discovering, which is what we suspected, a lot of movement just along the coast here from Manawatu Estuary, particularly down to Ohau Estuary, south of Levin, which also has a population of Godwits, and there's quite a bit of movement there. But some interesting things this winter we had some birds that were young birds staying here over the winter, and there were long periods where they just didn't seem to be at the estuary, but they were up the beach, up at Himatangi along the beach somewhere along there, and seemingly not being here for some period. So I don't know what combination of conditions made it better there. We have some that go to the Rangitikei estuary reasonably well, and last weekend I was here and spotted a couple of birds that that have transmitters on them, a different type. And here's the one where global events worked against us. So a French group was looking at doing tagging of a range of shorebirds in the Pacific region, and they wanted to work on Godwits, but it was difficult in New Caledonia, so we agreed that we could put some tags on here in New Zealand. And these were GPS tags that use a system that German researchers had established on the International Space Station. So basically there's a receiver on the space station for these tags, and it meant that we could get really accurate GPS quality information and altitude and things on these tags, and they would keep going. So he sent out 10 of these, and we got most of them out on birds. It was all going well, they're all collecting data, and then Russia invaded the Ukraine, and the International Space Station, all the functionings on this sort of thing went by the by. So they had some technical issues, and then they just put the pay to that whole thing. So there's been no data obtained from this whole system of tracking that was just really gearing up globally since about January. So we have birds that had working transmitters, GPS transmitters on their backs that have flown up, that would have given us exactly where they went. It would have given us the altitudes they fly at, and they've come back down again, and we know nothing. So it's a bit of an unfortunate thing, but it's the way it is. So I haven't been out since last week, but I had 153 Godwits here on Sunday, and about 17 red knots, which is the other migratory species that we have a reasonable number of here. So the migrations of Godwits is quite simple, to go from here to East Asia, from East Asia to Alaska, and then Alaska down to here, if all goes well. The red knots is a bit more complex. They go from here to probably northern Australia or Papua New Guinea, we're not 100% sure, then up through the coasts of China, refuel there, and then they head off to Russia rather than to Alaska. And on the way back they pretty much do the same thing. They come back through China, probably the southern coasts of east coast of China, then back through probably Papua New Guinea and northern Australia, and then to eastern Australia or even southern Australia and here. So they typically take longer to arrive because they spend longer on stopovers. So we've only got like 17 of those. We'll get up to 80 or 100 or 120 later on. So that's about the state of play. We still have birds in the air, Godwits that are being tracked flying down. Young birds, they tend to leave a bit later than adults. And in a first, Jesse, some of you know Jesse Conklin, the American chap who sometimes comes and lives out here every March. He and other colleagues went to Alaska to try to tag juveniles, growing juveniles with satellite tags for the very first time, to see what happens with these birds that have never flown before on this migration. Because the big unknown for us is what happens with first time flyers who have never gone. How many never make it? What happens to them? And so they had to catch little chicks and put little radio transmitters on them so they could track those chicks until they were medium-sized chicks, big enough to have a satellite tag on them, and then put a satellite tag on them, and then hope that they would stay on, etc., etc. And they managed to get 3 of these on them. I think 2 of the tags were still working, but then Alaska had this huge storm a couple of weeks ago that flooded most of the area. It looks like all the birds just stayed put. They've got some transmitters still transmitting, but they don't know whether they're still on birds or whether the birds are alive. So we could get a big surprise in a week's time. Jesse might say, we've got a bird in the air, or it might be that we just get signals from Alaska and it didn't come to fruition, which is, it's always a gamble, always a lottery. You never quite know how it's going to go. So yeah, that's about what I've got to say.
Yeah, Phil, could you, have you done the research on the actual health of the estuary itself, on the ability of the estuary to be able to cope with the numbers of birds?
This estuary?
Yes, because each time, although we've seen that the numbers are consistent between this year and last year, but on the basis of when that lady said they would come down here, we would come down here as school children, and we could have been, the estuary could be hosting 400 and 500 without any problem.
Yeah.
So the actual health of the estuary and its ability to be still regarded as a homecoming for the cool.
So interesting that for Godwits, the numbers in the 1960s were about 200, and then they went up. They went steadily up through the 1970s and 1980s till by the early 1990s there were over 500 here, and the highest count was about 545 or something like that. And since then, it's been a fairly systematic, slow decline since then, which is a different change to what we see in the national population. So the national population hasn't halved in that time. It's gone down, but it hasn't gone down that much. So it looks like the local population is going down in a way that the national population isn't. But the thing that I find interesting is that the adult birds, we get really high returning rates of them. So I think the adults that come back here, I think they're doing completely fine. But I think the thing that's happening is that young birds are coming here and then they are exploring the country and they're deciding to go somewhere else. So my suspicion is that they look around and find other places that are better for them. Yet this still can, clearly this can support adult godwits fine. But the young ones are choosing not to come here. So it could be that conditions are still, you know, good for the birds, but somewhere else is better. So in a way, but we know that we've done intermittent mud sampling over the years. We need to do more, and it looks as if the number of worms has gone down in the sediments, and that's one of the major food items. So it's possible that is influencing them. But in the same breath, as I said, the adults come here and they do completely fine. They know what they're doing.
So why do the worms go down?
We don't know, but it could be related to sort of long-term changes in sedimentation. There can be ironies that, you know, certain worm species can do quite well in polluted areas, you know, and enriched areas. So you go outside a sewage outfall on a mudflat, there's lots of ones that are tolerant of high nutrients. So you could have a situation where you clean up the water quality, you clean up an estuary, and certain species go down a number. And if they were ones that were a good food item, I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it's possible. It could happen.
But not all nutrients are toxic, are they?
No, I don't think anything.
A lot do, but the other thing is we went through a period here on the customary and the cultural rights situation when the bay was actually full of bivalves, both the pithy and the cockle. Yeah. And the other one that has declined, if you were talking of polychaete worms, they also along the actual coastline, aren't they? In the salt water as well.
You have different species all around, but so the main one here is called Nikon estuarensis. It's a really common, widespread worm around New Zealand, but it's actually not very well researched. So I had a student who looked at them once, and they did.
There's a large flock of birds in the distance here. I can't work out whether they're godwits or what they are. There have been many individual godwits here for probably the last few weeks. But what we're waiting for at the moment is the main flock coming down from Alaska. And I think there's a couple of groups of them there. A bit hard to see at this distance. What I find amazing is that these main groups of birds actually time their journey down to the very day. I'm just walking around to the outer estuary where the sand dunes are. See if I can get a better view of those Godwits. So it's a bit of a walk. Good exercise, eh? It looks as though due to the tide being so low that the main flock of Godwits is going to be staying on the outer estuary over where those sand dunes are. So I might take a wander around and see if I can see them from close up. These little lines of waves show that the tide has just turned and it's on its way in again. It moves quite quickly once the tide turns. A few people wandering back from the sand dunes. It's the sand dunes, very popular recreation area. Off-roaders, fishermen down on the estuary there. And over here is the sanctuary for the Godwits and other birds. I don't know if you can see that very well in this light. That looks like a group of Godwits next to the flock of gulls on the water's edge, but hard to see from here. Let's see if I can get a better idea with my phone. Yep, the Godwits are resting at the moment, having a rest from feeding and flying. Yes, I wouldn't describe myself as a birding nut. I like birds of all kinds, but not exactly what you call a bird geek. But I guess I'm lucky to be living in this area